I hate that voice so much. That poor lady. I'm pretty sure it was just a computer that said that. I don't think they got an actual person.
Yeah, I think it's like the Microsoft Sam, but like the female voice for it, or something like that.
Okay.
Or the feminine voice.
So we're gonna see how this goes because I technically have another Meet going on in the background, but the cool thing about Google Meets is that it will tell me when my ping is spiking versus Zoom, which does not do that. So we're gonna just go ahead and get started here. This is mostly gonna be like an Afropessimism primer, just like how will the so-and-so cabal of Afro-pessimists approach this topic. I'm going to start with just a general overview about what it is. I'm not going to assume that everyone here knows it tit for tat. Then I'm talk about a couple key concepts and ideas. Then it's going to talk about mechanically what kinds of links that you could see, like if you're the policy links, the generic links, the kinds of links that you'll get from critical affirmatives, some of the impacts that are relatively common to pessimism, alternatives, and then just sort of, I think, the 5 best ways to approach answering that position, both from maybe a policy-esque perspective and also from a cave perspective. There's some overlap, but
are you screen sharing?
No, not yet. This is the pretext to the screen share, because before we get super deep into the presentation, I do have a piece of media that I want folks to watch, so that this isn't just like me mostly talking at folks and there's like some sort of like aesthetic and artistic reference that we can use to sort of help frame the concepts that are important to pessimism. So now I will start by sharing my screen. And of course it's going to full screen it because Zoom is low-key the devil. Does it show it as just like the presentation and slides?
It's like a portion of the screen.
I hate that it does this because it kind of makes it difficult to do multiple things at the same time.
Low-key, I only see like a thin strip to the right.
Do you see it now? Oh, it says it's pause, resume.
Okay, that's good. That's like a solid view of the screen.
Yeah, so now we're like,
I see everything.
Speaker notes. Yeah, why is it? Okay, so hopefully. Right, but you can still see the objectives thing, right? Because what I did was I pulled up the speaker notes, and as a result of me pulling out the speaker notes, it then shifted to a different screen. Just Mac boy issues, I guess. So like I said, objective, just develop a basic understanding of the key ideas that animate Afro-pessimism as a theoretical practice. How could that relate to the debates folks will have on the antitrust topic, and outline the ways to engage the argument and rounds. So before we get into the meat and potatoes of that, I want to play roughly about like 10 minutes from a film called Punishment Park. Punishment Park is a film that came out in 1971. It's a pseudo documentary or a drama film directed by Peter Watkins. Kind of takes some inspiration from like the Black Power mixtape, in which there are a bunch of Swedish news organizations that came over to the United States during the late 1960s throughout the mid 1970s to follow what was going on with the Black Power movement. But instead of following what was going on with the Black Power movement, this British and West German film crew is following the National Guard soldiers and police as they pursue members of a counterculture group across the desert. The film itself takes place in 1970 as the United States intensifies its involvement in the Vietnam War. So, there was the civil rights movement going on then, you had the feminist movement, you had people that were objectors to the war in the Communist Party, most of them being university students like y'allself. And they are arrested and face an emergency tribunal court made of various community members. So it's not just the police, it's not just the state. There are parents, there are factory workers, there's like the head of the draft board, who's like the chairman of the tribunal, right? And so with the state and federal jails to capacity, because people are protesting, people are hostile to participating in the Vietnam War, the convicted face the option of either spending their full conviction time in federal prison or 4 days in punishment park, where they have to traverse 53 miles of a really hot California desert in 3 days without water or food, while being chased by the National Guardsmen and law enforcement law enforcement officers as part of their field training. If they get to the end of the course and reach the American flag, they will be set free. If they fail by getting arrested, they will serve the rest of their sentence in federal prison. So the scene that we're gonna watch starts with Lee Robert Brown, who is a broadcaster and political advocate activist who is Black. He's a Black male or a Black man, and is introduced before this military tribunal to determine his fate. So get the timestamp going. And let me know if like the video is either laggy or hard to follow at any point. But y'all see the new screen that's being shared now? Should see a police officer just in a still frame.
Yep, I see it.
Yeah, we do.
Thank you. Thank you, Spencer. And there was also subtitles too, so hopefully you could follow along with the dialogue as well.
Described by the U.S. Senate Subcommittee on Law and Order, a necessary training for the law officers and National Guard of the country in the control of those elements who seek the violent overthrow of the United States government and the means of providing punitive deterrent for said subversive elements. You will speak only when you're spoken to, and at no other time. Each violation of this ruling will result in a citation from the contempt of court of 1 year in the federal penitentiary, in addition to the sentence duly passed. Finally, I wish to announce that we have with us at this time television film cameras of the national network, also those of Britain and West Germany. It is hereby hoped to document these proceedings and their results in the widest possible manner, as we know their import to be of vital concern to the people of the free world everywhere. Their coverage will be impartial. Now sentenced to spending 3 days in punishment park. First offender. Lee Robert Brown, well-known author, broadcaster, and political activist. You have accepted this course of your own volition as an alternative to your penal sentences. You understand you have 3 days and 2 nights in which to reach the United States flag flying 4.5 miles due north of the Bear Shadow Mountains. These you can see to your front.
miles and proceed directly to the United States flag.
Mr. Brown, did you actually advocate overthrow of our United States? I refuse to answer that question on the grounds that it may tend to incriminate me. That's my right under the Fifth Amendment of the United States Constitution. And overrule that.
Stand against the experiment of people like you, experiments like you and your friends.
The object of this course is simple. You must evade capture by the pursuing law enforcement officers and reach the flag by the appointed time. That is to say, 10 o'clock on the evening of the third day from now. Your capture or your failure to complete the course within the given limit of time will result in a reversion to your penal term. Objection. Hey, man, I'll answer that motherfucking question. Hey, my language is immoral. What do you call that shit you just did, man? Why do you pull this shit here? Brian, give your sidearm to some hands for doing my part. You gonna call for revolution on that television? What you said? You gonna call for revolution? I would tell the truth. I would tell the story of black people like it has never been told in this country. But you never tell it. They never tell it. I would say what happened to Chicanos in this country. But the truth story ain't gonna tell it. And it's either they or members of their club who buys the time on that television set. I would tell what happens to people who are poor and uneducated and automated out of a job, who stand in long fucking lines talking to little people like you, illusions of power and unemployment lines all day long, bumped off with my girl man that called you right last night. You gotta get your language.
There's a lady in the car.
Where? The fact that you've been bothering your children. The fact that you are friendly with the people who are powerless. The fact that you are the people in this country are living on the river. You want to listen or you want to talk? You don't want to hear my message, man.
We want to hear your
You don't want to hear my message. It's been 50 years evolving a propaganda system that'll take the truth and change it to what you want to hear. You don't want to hear shit that's going to mean you might have to give up on. You don't want it. All you want to do is sit on your fat, dividend-growing ass and draw dividends.
You act like that. You just reacted moments ago, didn't I? You called me bitch and other names. Did I react like that?
All I can do is call you a dirty name.
These officers have strict instructions not to molest you in any way. Or to in any way hinder you from reaching your ultimate destination. However, they will not allow you to leave our city.
That's been stated this morning. There are more color television sets and automobiles owned by black people in the United States than all of Russia together. That shows a very intense interest in the economics of this country. You know,
Well, nobody
they do have. They have a standard of living that's better than any in the world. You can take an identical thing for every animal in the zoo. I show they standard of living. They certainly eat fucking like that.
The time is now 9:54 a.m. Continue will commence the course. At 12 noon, that's to say 2 hours from now, pursuit forces will be set in motion against you. Today's pursuit force will consist of a unit of the National Guard, part of the Tactical Riot Squad of the City Police Department, 3 federal marshals.
At the Cinco de Mayo Congress of Chicano youth, the defendant was quoted as saying, "You, I say, free your communities, arm yourselves. Pigs comprehend nothing but force to liberate yourselves. Off the pig, kill the pig, liquidate the mayor, the governor, and
That's
Why don't you read the rest of it? Anybody can break that shit out of context.
Agent Donovan finishes.
So we have on it. Big Donovan. This man is writing things going from violence home, but he's running this country, and it's doing more civilized, non-violent place. And it ain't. America is as psychotic as it is lawful, and violence is the only goddamn thing that will command your attention. This country, America, was born in violence. Like a revolution, it's a violent thing. Right now, some people, my forebears, were violently brought here like this from Africa, where they were violently made to work. It was upon the labor of their back, so violently wrung out of them that this country was industrialized. Right away, that's true. This land that we stand on, and all the rest belongs to the country. It's violently taken from the Indians. Violent.
Okay, that's about it, at least in terms of what I believe is relevant to this presentation. Do folks want to share some of what they think of this sort of segment of this film does in relationship to what you might know about anti-Blackness or Afropessimism?
Well, it was kind of hard to hear, but I feel like the protagonist's antagonism towards the US government is central to anti-Blackness.
Yeah, so what about that antagonism? Like what of what he was sort of communicating, if you were reading the subtitles or if you could hear it, is reflective of that antagonism that pessimism says is important? If you're not sure, that's fine as well. Just make sure you communicate that.
Oh, are you asking me?
Yeah, I was mostly asking whoever was it Spencer, I think?
Yeah, it was me.
Yeah, I was asking you to sort of follow up on what you identified.
Oh, well, I guess it would be the unflinching paradigmatic analysis that he was putting forth.
Well, okay, so I was eventually going to get to that point. Like we were going to get that was, you were like in the way future. But since we're already heading there now, what about what Lee Robert Band was saying is reflective of an unflinching paradigmatic analysis of the United States?
Well, I'm not sure, but when he was I refuse to answer that question because it might incriminate me, that insinuates that his stance is totally against the United States as an institution.
Yeah, that's definitely fair. I think that's one moment. And I think another moment is towards the latter half. Oh yeah, go for it. Who?
What I wanted to add to the conversation was when the protagonist was talking about kind of the history of America and how America was founded on violence, more specifically anti-Black violence, when he notes that African people were brought on slave ships to America and forcefully made to work against their will.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a moment of unflinching paradigmatic analysis, the importance of violence to the Constitution and construction of America, not just in its initial birth, i.e. revolution. Remember, he's like, revolution is a very violent thing, but also in the way in which labor was expropriated and fully sort of extracted from African bodies to make them in tools to produce a settler colonial state. And that concept of America being born in violence is something that's really integral to how pessimism understands things like progress, how it understands things like political advocacy, and the types of energy that we can use in order to confront systems of oppression and regimes of violence. All right, so with that out of the way, what is Afropessimism? Afropessimism is a lens of interpretation that accounts for civil society's dependence on anti-Black violence. This violence positions Black people as internal enemies of civil society and cannot be analogized with other forms of violence that constitute the worker, which is capital, Marxism, subaltern, post-colonial studies, immigrant, non-Black queer, or non-Black women. Critical theory tends to argue that structural violence operates differently on different populations, or that there's a common apparatus of violence that sustains the oppression of all sentient beings and assumes that all sentient beings are humans. So to unpack that a little bit, so the idea that structural violence operates differently on different populations shouldn't be too foreign, right? Insofar as like there's a difference in the type of violence that happens to someone that's subject to domestic assault. That's different from the type of violence that someone is subject to if they are a worker. This is distinct from the type of violence somebody is subject to if they have a disability, so on and so forth, right? The alternative to that is that there is a common sort of structure of violence, i.e. capitalism, i.e. colonialism, i.e. patriarchy, that sustains the oppression of other sentient beings, other, people in the world. And then the last assumption that critical theory makes as an assumption is that all sentient beings are human beings. That you have the capacity to think, you have the capacity to form feelings, sentiments, have some type of interior life, or you can sort of think for and about yourself, that all of those are innate functions of humanity. And a lot of that comes from the work that was done in the 17th century with Enlightenment philosophy that attach rationality, reflection, and, self-assurance, the self-contained atomized individual to as an innately human function. Afropessimism argues that critical theory, political economy, and sociology's lumping of Blacks as humans and that their suffering is analogous to others is not correct, right? That this is actually a detriment to critical theory, political economy, and sociology, because the suffering of Blacks and of slaves is distinct from the suffering of the human others that we outlined above. Everything Afropessimism challenges about critical theory and most social political theories is that it imagines some form of optimism in culture's emancipatory potential to produce change through discourse, right? That we can exchange words, that we can exchange ideas, and that's ultimately what's going to bind us together into coalitions, bind us together into social formations, and that is what enables broader change. And I think a moment from the clip that we just saw that reflects that is roughly about 12 minutes in. I think maybe even a little bit earlier, like right around when Lee Robert Brown was like claiming the Fifth Amendment, and then he starts using what they say was described as colorful language. And so the tribunal is like, watch your language, right? That there's something important to communication that makes it so that we can relate to different groups of people, right? Afropessimism argues that the Black, or the slave, is foreclosed from the transformative powers of discursive capacity, i.e. the ability to use discourse as a revolutionary or transformative aspect of a given social or political relation. And that the Black is foreclosed from this discursive capacity from a violence that undergirds such a displacement. And I think another moment that reflects that in that video is roughly around like the 14-minute mark, where like they're still complaining about Lee Roberts Brown language, his aggression, his affect, right? And after a certain point, he goes, like we're in a different position. This is all I can do. Like I'm out here, I'm in chains, right? I am literally, my body, as my flesh is limited in terms of what things I can actually do to, you know, enunciate myself or to have presence in the world, right? So positioning in some ways dictates the ways in which certain aspects of discourse actually and ultimately work for particular bodies, especially as it relates to Blacks and Blackness. So let me see, because the way screen sharing works, it's hard to see the chat box. So if folks are asking questions, I'm probably not seeing them.
What is the displacement in the last note?
Violence. The displacement is being foreclosed through the transformative powers of discourse. So like you can't use discourse as a revolutionary or productive way of engaging civil society or the world. So another important thing about Afropessimism is that it theorizes Blackness as an effect of structural violence versus viewing Blackness as a performance, i.e. some form of authenticity or an embodiment of cultural and ethnic attributes and practices. So pessimism works at what we call a level of abstraction, right? That's thinking about how does this concept of Blackness operate on a paradigmatic and therefore structural level, right? Because like Blackness is a thing that is created. Like there wasn't no functional Blacks until the Iberian slave trade to the Middle Passage, right? Because there were just a continent of people that were from Africa, right? Blackness is a thing that has been invented through various formations of violence, through various institutional arrangements and intimate connections that help cohere or bind the world that we live in. And the usage of the world is definitely intentional in the works of Afro-pessimists, and I think a lot of scholars that talk about Blackness and anti-Blackness. Pessimism argues that anti-Blackness is a central structural feature of global white supremacy, or the world, that emerged from the mid-15th century Iberian slave trade. So there are a lot of people that like to say, oh, Afro-pessimism is super focused on the United States, or oh, Afro-pessimism is limited by its overfocus on the Middle Passage. But there's definitely instances in this discussion happening before the Middle Passage, especially in English literature. I just like downloaded that book the other day. Let me see if I can find it real quick. At least the title, and I'll put it in the chat later as well. There you go. It is called Anti-Black Racism and Early Modern English Drama, The Other by Matthew Chapman. And it's really the book is like the first book that uses Afro-pessimism to engage the way in which we talk about English literature. It's particularly things like Othello, which is interesting because there was just sort of this idea in English that there were no Black people in England at the time, right? And regardless of whether or not there was like a physical presence of Black people, the fact that Othello was able to be such a popular tragedy at the time, and as a result, it really helped and frame things about like, how do we understand subjects? How do we understand what is human? What does agency do in terms of certain people's capacity and so on? But if you want to look at that book explicitly, I would definitely encourage you to do so. Another similar book that Afro-pessimists refer to sort of talk about the global nature and the sort of paradigmatic feature of anti-Blackness is Lewis Gordon's Anti-Black Racism and Bad Faith. The other important sort of aspect of Afro-pessimism, it argues that the coherence of reality, what really binds us together as a community of human beings amongst other human beings is this anxiety of over both the idea and the presence of Blacks. So to unpack that bullet point just a little bit, the ideal of the idea of Blacks is just referring to the fantasy or the figure. And I mean like figure in terms of like the literary sense in which like you are using language, you are using descriptors to create a depiction of a representation of a person. So like whenever you read a book, it's not an actual person, right? It is a figure of, you know, what we might think is a strong protagonist, what we might think is an antagonist, what we think is a character that we can relate to. And and I think the other way you can think of figures are like tropes. So like the tropes that you see in media of particular characters, especially in sitcoms, those are figures of people. They're the ideas of what we think people can be and act like. So this fantasy or figure tends to kickstart the pathological anxiety in human subjects that can be called Black. So like you just have this boogeyman, this specter that when you encounter it either consciously or unconsciously, just sorts of kickstart an effective response that's just like, nah, I don't want any part of that. And I think we can also see that in the film in terms of like how they're going about this interrogation of Robert Lee Brown, right? There's something about his presence, something about his general orientation that induces anxiety before he even says anything. Or even is saying things that like are even cohesive to be understood as an argument or a position against civil society.
I got a question. How does Afropessimism, like on the note of like it being explaining global white supremacy and then like the idea of non-Black community, how does it explain or interact with colorism in like non-Black communities? Like
it would
colorism.
Oh, that's actually a good question. I think that's going to be answered a little bit later.
Okay.
Especially in terms of when we're talking about the presence of a Black.
Yeah.
So, and this fantasy or this figure that kickstarts this particular anxiety in human subjects creates a state of non-relation and abjection for Blackness as a phobogenic object, that Blackness is a thing that generates fear in a generally stable psyche. A lot of this comes from Frantz Fanon, Black Skin, White Mask. That's where a lot of the writings about Blackness as a phobogenic object come from. And also the works of David Marriott and On Black Men and Haunted Life. To sort of transition to start answering Irshad's question, the part that's talking about the presence of Blacks is talking about the material or real sentient beings, humans or otherwise, that reflect that sort of idea of Blackness. This is not just limited to how whites and non-Blacks and how they feel about Black people, but even people that we identify as Black, African American, so on, can also participate in the psychic melodrama as well, because Blackness is a thing that they are not, right? They're trying to negate that particular pathological element in order to be part of this thing that we call humanity, which in turn produces things like colorism, right? The idea that the darker you are, the less desirable that you are, the less sort of capable you are, the closer you are to whiteness or lightness. It means that you are actually more reflective of this thing that we call humanity. So a lot of those, especially if you think about Brazil in particular, in like the really intense color caste system, right? That is something that's really animated by anti-Blackness, and pessimism would argue that that anxiety comes from viewing Blackness as a phobogenic object. I guess the last question before I move on, I mentioned abjection briefly when talking about the idea of Blacks. Do folks here know what abjection is, or needs like some clarification as to what that particular word means in terms of critical theory?
Like being represented as like nothingness or evilness.
Not just representing something as nothingness or evilness, but abjection, especially in the sociological context, is used to describe bodies or things that an individual or community finds repulsive or disgusting. And in order to retain a sense of identity, those things are repressed or ostracized or socially neglected from a given society, creating the conditions for marginalization and social exclusion. Julia Kristeva, who is primarily the scholar that is attributed to the usage of this word abjection, because it in some way comes from psychoanalysis, also argues that institutions and organizations tend to rely on social rituals and structural practices, i.e. the creations of laws and policies, in addition to the actual associative or filial relationships that people may make in a given community, as in who will they let in into their community, who will they exclude from their community, work to sustain this process of abjection. All right. So these are sort of like the key concepts and ideas that are going to happen in any given pessimism debate. And some of these might actually, roll over to other conversations about anti-Blackness. The first one is that we should prioritize a paradigm or position versus performance and identity. The reason why is because if you focus on things paradigmatically, a lot of the sort of deviations and differences in performances don't matter when it comes to understanding how those things apply to Blackness and the slave. The ways in which, if you look at things paradigmatically, right, sometimes even if there might be intramural differences between Black men and Black women, queer Black folk, not queer Black folk, right, once it comes to their sort of place in the world, that association of Blackness and slaveless sort of overcodes and overwrites any capacity to effectively levy those performances as a relational aspect or as a way of, creating a sense of coherence and belonging. This comes from both Anna, Mill Passage, in ways in which Hortense Spillers outlines that gender was in some ways separated from the slave, in the ways in which they were categorized as just pure cattle, pure object, right? Your gender differentiations didn't matter as much in terms of your capacity to be used as generative labor. Can you be accumulated in a way that allows for the growth of agrarian or industrial society versus whether or not your actual body represents that and foremost? Because another distinction pessimism uses to sort of, interrogate or antagonize that idea of performance is that there were the way in which slaves labored, they were often alongside each other. There were female slaves that worked in the field. There were female slaves that worked in the house alongside male slaves. And while the minutia might be different, the totality of their situation is that they were still enslaved. Modern context, as in the context of police violence, right? It doesn't necessarily matter if you are a man, woman, child, straight, gay, etc. If you are Black and you trigger that anxiety that we're talking about, that pathological anxiety, then you are subject to the violence that allows for civil society to cohere itself and have a sense of value in its institutions, its cultural practices, its norms, etc. The other key concept is this idea of conflict versus antagonism. We kind of covered that in the first slide after the objective, talking about how things aren't, how certain forms of violence are not analogous, or how certain forms of structural systems that produce subjection or produce oppression are not equalizable. This is because for pessimism, especially for Wilderson, the issues of capitalism, the conflicts between the worker and the boss and who controls the means of production, are there ways to distribute that or redistribute the economy so that's more equitable? The issues of patriarchy, who's at the seat of power? Is it the ones that are men, those that have, particular genitalia, immigrants? Example, we can the conflict is whether or not we can include them as citizens within the fold of a democracy, right? How do we determine the process in which someone can leave one community and go out to another community, right? Those things are resolvable. May they be through change in orientation, may that be through discursive transformation, because all of those particular entities are human, right? Or may it be through structural rearrangement. For pessimism, anti-Blackness is not a thing that it can be resolved by a simple conflict. It is something that requires a overwhelming change to the world that we live in. There again, the word world. World is distinct from the ways in which we can conceptualize the earth, which is like a territorial body that rotates around the sun 365 days a year and has various features to it. The world is the series of institutions, social meanings, values, cultural perspectives that sort of work to make sense of the territorial body that we call Earth. So that being said, anti-Blackness is viewed as an antagonism for Wilderson and for Sexton is because after a certain point, you can start to see where the sort of rubrics and analytics of Marxism, the rubrics and analytics of feminism, the rubrics and analytics of post-colonial studies kind of fall in the face of the Black. For Marxism, it's definitely the issue of the former Soviet Union, and today the issue of Cuba, the way in which Cuba relates to its Afro-Cuban population and Black population, right? Despite it being one of the few communist countries that are out there, it's not that the Black people there have any sort of structurally better life than the Black people that you might see in the United States or what you might see in Africa and so on. Those are just degrees of difference. Those degrees of difference don't necessarily, extend to a full degree difference in like conclusion in terms of how we can understand anti-Blackness as a structural component and as a paradigmatic component. Next concept that's important is the roots of analogy, that the violence that happens towards slave and those that are attached within that legacy of slavery is not analogous to other forms of oppression or other isms, that there's something about that violence is distinct and works to keep people collectively organized, etc. Then there's ontology versus political ontology. So ontology, hopefully some of us are familiar with, just affirms the idea that knowledge claims about the world are also interpretations about what sorts of beings are there to be known, right? The more simple explanation of that is ontology just says knowledge can give us the capacity to figure out what does it mean to be, how do we formulate identity? Political ontology is asking, how do those beings operate in a given political field? Do they have capacity to make political demands? Can they have injury that is recognized and injury that can be redressed as a result of their ontological positioning? For the slave and for the Black, that is not possible as they are barred from humanity, right? Because humanity is not a given. Humanity is not just an innate thing that's waiting for us all to achieve. Humanity is a process that is of contestation, that has been contested legally, socially, politically, historically. So there's a series of meanings that are made that gives coherence to this thing that we call human beings. Like a human being is distinct from the Homo sapien classification. The reason that distinction should be worth interrogating, especially considering that, as Lee Robert Brown said, violence is what situates a lot of the sort of value systems that allow us to sort of think collectively as not just Americans, but also on a global level as well. And then finally, I think the last important point is that slavery is not a historical event that ended in 1865, but is a relational dynamic that animates as well as captures the ways in which institutions and individuals work to maintain anti-Black violence. This is going to be a big part of those debates that you engage in, especially if you are affirmative against pessimism, right? Because the way that they're going to try to frame out your arguments is that whatever you're talking about, may it be, competition, may it be labor practices, like the labor practices of Amazon that necessitate that maybe we should break it up so that people can have more sort of organizational power, more sort of actual political power to advocate for themselves and form things like unions, right? Slavery is what animates those particular conflicts, right? There's the perfection of slavery can be seen in the ways in which Amazon uses biometric tracking to measure the heart rate, the standing time, the speed of its workers, right? Because that's functionally a thing that was developed in antebellum slavery through the logistical tracking of how much cotton the slave picked at a given time, how many pounds of cotton they picked, how quickly they were able to move. all those regulatory components that we can see in modern day capitalism get their genesis from the architecture of slavery, which is not just a historical thing that happened from 1619 to 1865, but is a structural component that follows every great civilization, which is the argument Orlando Patterson outlines in the book Slavery and Social Death. So before we start talking about some of the links, do folks have like questions about some of these key concepts and ideas before we move on?
Yeah, could you go back to political ontology versus ontology? Like what is the difference exactly?
So ontology is mostly just concerned with how does knowledge produce beings? Like how are we able to classify, what makes a student, what makes a mother, what makes a daughter, so on and so forth, what makes a worker, right? Political ontology is less concerned about the sort of qualities of those things versus like how do those qualities operate within a given political or structural field. So like it doesn't necessarily matter like what your identity is versus like how can you mobilize that identity as political currency in order to be recognized as a political subject that is worthy of energy, that is subject of injury and worthy to be redressed, that you can consent and that you have the ability to be seen as a relational force in terms of how we politically organize ourselves in a given society.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, one other thing. I don't know if this phrase, I remember it being in red, black, and white with Rusev analogy, but I don't really get it. Like the evidence of absence versus the absence of evidence distinction.
I'm like pausing because I'm like, that's like a weird throwback to like the Iraq War and Donald Rumsfeld trying to justify like the invasion of Iraq. So like all that really, the Rusev analogy argument, all it's really saying is that if we can understand that slavery is not a historical event that ended in 1865, but a relational dynamic, right? And that there is something that happened in the Middle Passage in the transatlantic slave trade that works to, instead of making slavery a general function that everyone is subject to, but is part of a very particular segment of people, like there's a particular group of people that this world was designed to be enslaved, which is the terminal conclusion that Europeans made in the 17th century moving forward, right? Then those particular beings don't have any sense of presence because like they're object. There are things meant to be accumulated. They are meant to be the use of more rational, self-affirming, centered beings that can make better use of them as a result. So like, even if like, for example, like I have this piece of paper here, right? Obviously paper is not sentient, but like I can do what I want with this paper. I can crush it, like I can tear it, I can form it into a paper airplane, I can do whatever I want and what I will of it. Even the paper, even as I crush the paper, those crushes or screams, I don't have to acknowledge the presence of that violence, of that injury, because it's a thing for my use and appropriation. Does that help it sort of make sense?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. There are no other questions. If you're just saving your questions to the end, that's fine, but we're going to just move on. We have like roughly about 10 or so minutes for this given lecture. So here are the kinds of links that you're likely to encounter if you're a policy, and even sometimes if you're K. So the first, or if you're a KF, I hate saying things up. If you're K, like what does that even mean? So the first one is just in general, states, institutions, civil society, those things are anti-Black. You affirm them either through things like saying that we need to just engage the state, we need to have some sort of regulatory structure for big corporations to prevent monopolies. Just engaging that process in and of itself is anti-Black because of the framing stuff that we said earlier about how violence is what gives coherence to these strategies that makes them legitimate, right? A lot of the ideals that were founded in the Revolutionary War in 1776 are still ideals that people will refer to back today. People still refer to the Federalist Papers, this, that, and the third. But if all those particular sort of justifications for governance, for the state, for our social formations are sutured and maintained through violence as its starting point, then it's fundamentally not a thing that we should regularly engage. The next second tier of links, which will apply for both policy and non-policy arguments, is the sort of progress, good, or redemptive narrative, that there's something to be reclaimed from civil society, may it be humanity, may it be agency, may it be, we can actually redress the injury of these big monopolies and corporations through things like law, while we disavow the ways in which the flexibility of the law can also engender or ensure someone's particular subjugation. And the general reason why they make these link arguments is sort of add more offense to some of the impacts that if we continue to sort of attach ourselves to these narratives of progress, it ultimately will allow for more disavowal or mystification of anti-Black violence that will perpetually happen. The reason why this is important is because the argument that pessimism makes, unlike things like settler colonial genocide, unlike other forms of violence, right, in which there's either assimilation or complete destruction, there's never going to be a complete destruction of Blacks, because it is the violence that civil society and that individuals do in order to cohere in a world is necessary to sustain. So like the argument they make is that pessimism will make is that if there was no sort of group of people that we can identify as Blacks or the attachment to Blackness, the world would lose its shit because there's no outlet for that violence, right? And this is what like psychoanalysis is some ways important to the undergird formations of pessimism, because it's really talking about two different levels. One, how can we talk about violence thematically? To what are the sort of unconscious or sort of, just unconscious ways in which we organize and desire that reflect and sustain things like anti-Blackness, consciously or not. The next argument or style link is going to be the starting point or positioning arguments, the grammar of suffering type arguments, that since you don't start with the position of the slave, you will obfuscate or mystify the slave's grammar of suffering that is key to the coherence of civil society in the world. If you notice, some of these don't really sound that distinct, right? They generally kind of fall back to civil society, fall back to an anti-Black world, but these are just sort of different sort of like, if you want to think of it like a salad, different kinds of dressings of that particular kind of link argument. Links to humanism may be through the idea that people can use their discursive capacities to represent themselves as rational, self-contained individual beings, and therefore view themselves as protagonists in this great line of history, that we are the ones that are going to make change, and that this change is going to innately improve for the betterment of all those that we consider human in a given society. The point of pessimism is that humanism has its limits. There are just certain aspects, certain sort of behaviors, practices that will trigger a particular anxiety in what we consider as a rational subject, i.e., I think the greatest sort of example of this anxiety is like when people talk about, why are they looting? Why are they burning their own buildings? Like, that's not what we would do. That's not the rational thing people would do, right? That shows a limit to what sort of certain capacities are accessible to human beings in terms of their ability to politically enunciate themselves in a given social field or world. Then we have law. Very simple way we think the flexibility of the law is sutured by the violence of anti-Blackness. Not only can we have progressive reforms, those reforms are reversible. The greatest example of that being like the Voting Rights Act, the constant sort of battle that we're even having now with Republicans even passing more strict voter requirement restrictions. What does it really mean for the law to be an avenue of change if it is just sort of not contextualized to structural positioning, that it is this sort of abstract amalgamous thing that can both be our salvation and also be our destruction? sort of the more what is going to be like, I think the more contextual framing of a lot of these link arguments in the context of this topic is going to be regulation, i.e. that the affirmative views regulation as the ability to sort of redress the injury of large multinational corporations, of monopolies, of the ways in which those anti-competitive practices ultimately impact the consumer, right? The idea that we can regulate the excesses of that violence to produce a more better society is one that allows us to sort of provide a conceptual stopgap on the way in which anti-Blackness and slavery as a relational force provides the pretext in which that regulation is required. I feel like this is going to be the most common framing argument for pessimism, and even some anti-Blackness cases in terms of how they're going to approach their links to the topic or the resolution writ large. And then finally, coalitions. Coalitions for pessimism tend to be anti-Black, insofar as that they generally relegate Black demands to the back burner. They'll either try to make compromises or flinches with the institutions of civil society and the state that ultimately, at the end of the day, secure anti-Black violence. All right, as for the KAFs, the links that pessimism is going to make is that your attempts to refashion, reclaim conceptions of subjectivity, identity, or agency only work to sustain an anti-Black world, right? You think you're being revolutionary, but what you're really doing is collapsing back on the humanist assumptive logics that you were initially critiquing, because you think there's something redemptive about subjectivity when it's sutured in violence, identity when it's been sutured in violence, or agency, which has been produced through that violence as well. Performance, we already covered this briefly over the positioning versus performance stuff. Performance tends to work at the level of identity or experience that mystifies the broader structural or paradigmatic arrangements of anti-Blackness that allows violence to cohere itself, meaning that performance ultimately allows us to sort of create a fantasy of flight in terms of how we approach the question of structural violence of political performance or engagement. Then we also have critical theory. That's the active link, right? So the other thing that you want to do is make sure you have links to critical theory. So like with Right and Black, Afropessimism, they all have arguments about why post-colonial studies doesn't really speak to the grammar of the slave, why non-Black feminism can collapse back into anti-Black practices, queer studies, Marxism, and so on. There is a bunch of different content and evidence for this, right? So just because of the space of time, I'm not going to go into the nuances of these things, but that's something that you can definitely push folks to for in terms of office hours. And then finally, the last link that will also happen is discourse as the basis of resistance. Not to say that discourse is like not important, right? It's just not essential for how we can orient ourselves as like individuals or sentient beings in a given social field, right? Because the ways in which positioning is going to dictate what types of discourses are legible, what types of discourses are understandable and are worthy of receiving redress from the injuries that they are describing through that particular discourse. Impacts, just in general, social death. Social death is comprised of three things: natal alienation, which just means that you have no general family ties that are recognizable within civil society, right? When Tamara Rice was shot, no one thought that, that was somebody's child. They just saw a phobogenic body holding what seemed to be like a gun. Didn't matter, this child was not even probably any more than 5'3", but still composed a particular threat. The other aspect of social death is general dishonorment, which means that you have no form of political agency, no culture that is worth fundamentally recognizing, right? So again, to backtrack to protest, the ways in which people are sort of innately repulsed by the idea of destroying large businesses, small businesses, any sort of representation of, you know, American capitalism and its sort of ability to produce various actors, right? It's not seen as legitimate that somebody who feels generally disbarred from the social field and the political field, that their response to that would be to use violence to get people's attention in the situations in which discourse hasn't worked. That method of using violence as a means of enunciating is generally dishonored for the Black, for the slave, despite being the pretext for how, you know, America can be, or even how America sustains itself on a geopolitical level. Ontological violence, violence at the level of ontology. Fanon says there's no ontological resistance in the eyes of the white man for the Black, which just functionally means that no matter how you choose to identify yourself, how you choose to pronounce your being, especially discursively, it is not worth being recognized. And that sort of disbarment, that site of abjection, is what creates the conditions for things like gratuitous violence, right? If you view as something that's ontologically distinct, as ontologically barred from your given metaphysical field or your given social relationships, then you don't really have to have any respect to it. So like, for example, in that film where Lee Robert Brown is talking at the beginning, you have that police officer literally come in and like muzzle his mouth shut, right? In order for someone to sort of even be in a position to exert that violence, you have to ontologically just sort of cast that person out from your purview. This happens not just intimately or individually, but it also can happen socially and structurally as well, in terms of how we view policing, how we view regulation, how we view what counts as legitimate political practice, etc. Gratuitous violence just is violence without restraint, violence without limitation. It can come in many different forms. The spectacular forms are like police killings and lynchings. The more quotidian or everyday forms is just the general disavowals that we do in order to sort of, you know, supplant the demands of slave, the sort of prioritization of Blackness as our focal point in understanding politics, civil society in the world. Black death, again, just the general structural neglect that produces things like ghettos, the lack of social services, close proximity to things like pollutants, general violence, both intramural violence and police and external violence, and then ethics. Ethics, I'm not sure if that comes up as much, but generally always my favorite thing for Ks is to have some type of ethics impact, especially if you're trying to turn the affirmatives' ability to sort of speculate about their impacts and their solvency, right? Because it's sort of like the old day fiat Ks in which you're like, you can't fiat the ass. So the only thing that we can control is our ethical orientation to things. I still feel like even if the nature of fiat-based affirmations have changed, ethics impacts are important for sort of framing like what can we do in the here and now, especially when we're using very analytical tools in order to go about talking about various political issues and various forms of violence. All right, so we're almost to the meat and the part I feel like people are more interested about, which is how do I answer this thing? So I'm just gonna blaze through these alts real quick. I feel like the 4 common alts that you'll see, or 4 sort of thematic themes of alts that you'll see in regards to pessimism is first, unflinching paradigmatic analysis. We talked about that earlier, and especially in terms of like how Lee Robert Brown was talking to the tribunal, how he was attempting to engage them through his analysis of America as this innately violent thing, right? Doesn't matter if you're the police officer, doesn't matter if you are the mother that's at line at the grocery store that sees a bunch of people that are the mother that's at the line of the grocery store who's slightly disturbed at this person that's buying a bunch of food using their EBT card. But when you look at things paradigmatically, it works to often like sort of provide a pretext for what types of actions that we can see as legitimate, what types of politics that we should orient ourselves for. It sort of sets a guideline in terms of how we approach solutions to violence that are generated in the discussions that we have in debate. So you can also think of an unflinching paradigmatic analysis as a orientation or perspective that operates in a way that is consistent with what is known as theoretical pragmatics. If you were in Greg's lecture, we talked about this, about like how to go for the alternative. We talked about this very briefly, but theoretical pragmatics is the practice of using theoretical interpretations of philosophy, economics, political theory, and art to challenge the present world or how we look at it, while not necessarily treating those interpretations as capital T truth, right? And so that's why a thing that's interesting about pessimism is not just purely based in theory, it's actually in very much based in like the creative world. So that's why, for example, Writing Black is a book about film. Incognito is part memoir, part political philosophy. Same thing with the newest book, Afropessimism, because we can use a bunch of different aspects of our world in order to make sort of broad, sweeping, paradigmatic claims about how it operates. I think the logic, especially for film, makes sense if you think about the arguments. And I hate to go back to Zizek here, because I know people have feelings about the near beard and just Zizek as a person or whatever. But a thing that I think he points out that's in the tradition of psychoanalysis is that so sometimes people make jokes. The jokes speak less about the content of the joke, but versus the anxieties of the person making that joke. Right. So if you're making a racist joke, it's less about like, haha, that's funny, more than like, oh, you have certain anxieties about Hispanic people and their ability to take your jobs, right? This can also work for film, as film is like, how do we take this territorial body of Earth? How do we take the sort of associated meanings of this thing that we call the world and sort of put them into a particular performative practice or task so that we can sort of see how those things can play out? How can we imagine different orientations of the world, which is why starting with Punishment Park is interesting, because it is a pseudo documentary. It takes the style of a documentary feature, of a news report, but uses the sort of symbols, the figures that could be used for that genre of filmmaking and applies it to the very contentious political times of the 1960s and 1970s in order to sort of produce a critique of the structure of US militarism, the structure of white supremacy and American conservatism that's put these youth in this particularly hostile position. The next genre of alternatives are like refusal to affirm, refusal of redemptive narratives. We are negative, we're in a space of negation. Blackness operates as a site of negation through its barring of humanity, through its rendering of Blackness as abjection. But if we can sort of engage that sort of refusal, that sort of those sort of pathological elements as the sort of kickstart generators of a thing that allows us to disrupt society and sort of kickstart revolutionary actions, we should refuse to affirm any extension of civil society, any extension of humanity as the basis for our politics. Third one is poesis as praxis. So that's like the card that y'all asked cut in the NC. Poesis just really means the process of making a thing or producing a thing. It is also considered the activity in which a person brings something into being that did not exist before. And then it's also sort of referencing Fanon, this notion of invention, right? In a world where I'm ontologically foreclosed or barred from civil society, right? Then it allows us to sort of invent new ways of conceptualizing being, new ways of conceptualizing society, and also being committed to that, right? Everything must go because without I am the thing that sort of binds the world into being is a very enabling sort of perspective and could steer you in directions that would advocate for more revolutionary ideas versus more sort of reformist and I guess more reformist ones. And then the last one is embracing Black nihilism. That's people using the work of Calvin Warren to, I'll be honest, I haven't spent a super deep amount of time looking at Warren, right? But the book Ontological Terrorism provides this formation of Black nihilism. If you embrace Black nihilism, it means that we're able to reject these progress narratives, these sort of, again, those sort of redemptive narratives that we talked about earlier, and allows us to sort of be untethered from the ways in which violence has sutured this thing that we call Blackness, because it sort of just is able to consume the sort of values and ethics of a generally unethical or violent civil society. Okay, and lastly, how do you go about answering Afropessimism? Well, I do think, and scholars do think, that there is a lot of power to the way it chooses to interpret the world. You can definitely challenge the thesis. You can say that things aren't ontologically barred. You can say progress is possible. You can say that redemptive narratives are good, that they do work not just for humans, but also those that have been barred from humanity, right? So just really simply just challenging the thesis of the criticism, I think, is your best bet, especially because Afropessimism makes such iconoclastic or ironclastic claims, right? That it isn't as sort of digestible as a bunch of other arguments or critical perspectives. So people always want to hold out hope. That's like what Obama won on, right? Like a platform of hope. We can do it, right? Yes, we can. That is a zeitgeist that really, motivates people and that you can use as an advantage to answer the argument. If you are on the K side, I think the second one is definitely more up your alley. Intramural conflicts are essential. So what pessimism and Wilderson would say, intramural conflicts, i.e. conflicts between Black women, Black men, conflicts between cis Black folk and queer Black folk, trans Black folk and cis Black folk, right? Those things are important, but they're not essential if you want to look at things paradigmatically. You can impact turn that. You can be like, these conflicts are essential, and dismissing the intramural on its own is a particular kind of violence, right? Especially this is where a lot of people use Black feminism, right? Black feminist scholars to sort of make this point that the labor of Black women and their sort of flesh is actually integral to how we can understand these paradigmatic formations of violence, and intramural conflicts are a necessary prerequisite before we can even start imagining the things like revolutionary poesis and unflinching paradigmatic analysis and so on. Definitely in the book, Anti-Blackness, that you were assigned to cut for the law link, there probably are materials to help you make these intramural arguments. I'm not going to try to out nobody, but I'm just saying somebody definitely already found some heat that they could use for these arguments. So definitely give that book a check out if you can. Right, and this is also true for class too. So that's why people read CAP, right? Because there is a distinct class difference between, middle class Black academics like Wilderson, Sexton, Hartman, and so on, and like the people that work at Target, the people who are homeless, the people who are without homes, the people who don't have access to real material things, right? And that we shouldn't sort of, paradigmatically take their moments of refusal and apply it to this grand theoretical schema, right? While it's cool to, make arguments about how when people are raiding the Target or burning down, stores while stealing the stuff out of them, like that's an expression of, the sort of pathological element of Blackness that works to disrupt civil society. It could also just really be that, people were hungry and people don't have clothes, or people were hungry and don't have clothes, and now they have a bunch of clothes that they can then sell either on, illicit markets or on eBay. And then they can buy themselves a new Gucci belt, or they can buy themselves a bunch of food, regardless of what those desires ultimately are, right? The point is that we shouldn't just sort of like abstract those things for our own necessary political purposes. The third argument that I feel like you definitely have to make, regardless of whether or not your policy or K, is that relationality is possible and has happened to produce coalitions, right? The same way in which people can talk about how the deaths of George Floyd, Virginia Boyd, Black Lives Matter protests, et cetera, that happened last summer, right? Shows the sort of terror that we can pose on civil society. Those particular protests were multiracial, they were coalitional, right? It wasn't just all Black people, it wasn't all just white people, right? So in the world where different bodies, different beings can come together and sort of try to enunciate themselves politically in the given community, what does that mean for pessimism's conception of coalitions? What does it mean for pessimism's understanding of solidarity? And does that solidarity really need to be one that's framed in a wholly anti-humanist or completely anti-humanist lens? The fourth argument is that slavery is relational, but it's not determinate. What that means is like, yes, there's an afterlife for slavery, but it is an afterlife. What is the shifts, the transitions that happen within that afterlife that allow us to cohere how violence functions in our modern world. The best place that sort of helped me think of this argument is just the way in which Saidiya Hartman's work has sort of pivoted. Like Hartman, not Hartman, Wilderson and Sexton like to refer back to scenes of dejection, some of the work that she did in the early 2000s as sort of like, you know, things that help us explain Afropessimism. Hartman is defiantly and very clearly, she says repeatedly that she's not an Afropessimist, right? Which is why her latest book, Wayward Lives and Beautiful Experiments, talks about the formation of the city, the formation of the domestic, and how that interrelates with the experience of Black women, Black femmes, and queer folk, especially Black queer folk in the early 20th century, right? So there are shifts that happen. So like, even though we can find apparatuses or manifestations or the ruins of the plantation in the domestic, right? Those things have a fundamentally different relationship that doesn't make slavery the wholly determinant force in those particular relationships. And last but not least, progress is possible, right? If you can prove that there is some positive change, even if those gains are reversible, right? But they're not wholly reversible to the point where we can't do absolutely nothing at all, or the only option is violent revolutionary break from civil society, then you're going to be in a much better position when you're offense on the aft, that the change that you do make some particular shift from the status quo, right? It is something that is distinct in how we conceptualize law, politics, humanism, etc. That's going to enable us to effectively, you know, create change in the world. So we're a little bit over, I think by like 14 minutes, but I still want to have some room for questions that folks might have before we go. Caitlin, is it cool if we take like the next 5 minutes to do that and then we can call it, or else we need to go into the next activity? So yeah, how about we just take a few questions and then we'll call it after those questions.
Okay, I got a question. Nobody else does. There's this specific Wilderson uses the figure of like Asada Shakur as a way of like how she threatens the human, and there was this specific quote I wanted to ask you about when he's talking about Asada, when he says, "A workers' revolution blows the lid off the economy. A post-colonial revolution blows the lid off the colony. A slave revolt blows the lid off the unconscious. The slave threatens order itself, whether manifest as a struggle between capitalist as a worker or as a generational struggle between parent and child." I was just wondering, like, and thinking about that in conjunction with like sometimes pessimists use like Farley as an alt. Does it relate to like material action at all? Can alt relate to material action, or just material things that affect the symbolic, or not?
I mean, it can insofar as like the conclusions of like things like paradigmatic analysis or burning the world down would be like the immaterial conclusion is like we should organize ourselves for revolutionary activity. That's why at the beginning of Red, White, and Black, he talks about particularly the zeitgeist of the political radical movements of the mid 60s and 70s, because that was a point in time in history where you had the AIM, the Black Panther Party, the Black Liberation Army, all being like, this is a fundamentally ethically bankrupt system. The ways in which we socially and communally organize are fundamentally unethical. They are sutured by violence, right? So the only real response to that is, you know, mobilizing ourselves in a way that we can actively challenge those institutions alongside cultivating spaces in which we can prepare people for revolution, thus things, and also materially provide for them things like the free breakfast program, daycare programs that the Black Panther Party was provided, and so on. Those are sort of the ways in which those broad theoretical abstractions translate into certain material pragmatic things, right? But what's really important is because the context matters and space matters, right? We are in debate. We are in some ways, the academy, we are having an academic and hypothetical discussion. At the end of the day, somebody votes aye, somebody votes negative. That doesn't necessarily guarantee material change, right? So like if at the end of the day, the actual material impacts of things, if we can even call them material, because we're still dealing with things that are symbolic, discursive, and theoretical and conceptual, then it's a question more of how do we orient ourselves to those things and how those orientations can produce various kinds of violence, both spectacular, really brutalistic, grotesque forms of violence, and more quotidian, everyday, but still in some ways equally grotesque forms of intimate violence that can happen between scholars, that can happen between individuals in those communities, in the ways in which we choose to ethically and analytically prioritize particular agent energies for various types of actions and conclusions. That's why the concept of the libidinal economy is important to pessimism, because the same way that you can have a economy that measures the ebbs and flows of capital, its distribution, who has it, who doesn't, the same way in which you can measure the economy of politics, who has political currency, who has agency, who are the stakeholders in a given social arrangement, right? The same thing can be done with desires, sentiments, feelings, and fantasies. Like, how do people identify with certain values? What attracts them to certain formations of social cohesion? What repulses them on the flip side? And that all these things, and having an understanding of the libidinal economy and how it sort of is sutured by this photogenic optic of Blackness, can give us the pretext to form other ways of relationality, and also sort of commit ourselves and understand why people flinch, why people collapse back to things like reformism, why people collapse back to things like humanism, right? Because that sense of belonging is what's going to provide the animus for how people cohere of themselves in relationship to those other sentient beings, human or otherwise.
That makes sense.
Glad something makes sense out of this whole. Been at it for a minute, so I'm glad something is clicking. Anybody else? Because I know we're at like 12:30, and I don't want to keep nobody any longer. At least PST, we're hitting the 12:30 mark.
I had. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, you're good.
Okay. I had a question about how whenever you're reading a chaos about like revolution and breaking down like some form of oppression for another group, how should you answer the argument that the AF tries to recreate like humanism?
By explaining, like, if you are creating, like, if you're not recreating humanism, like, what do you make, right? How do we understand being in a world that is distinct from the human, right? If we can understand that humans and humanism is produced through violence, that it sustains itself through violent means to produce violent ends, what about your particular praxis? What about your sort of configuration of that particular type of being is distinct? How does it make a break away, right? I guess that's a weird passing reference to Milton. Like, what is the break? What is the cut that you make from this sort of subjective understanding of humanity to invent something new? I'm not sure if that answers, like, I think that's like a thematic answer to your question, Jasmine, because I'm not really sure the exact way, because it depends on the AF and like what they're doing, right? But that's sort of like how thematically you would approach that portion of the debate. Does that make sense? Or is that something that resonates with you?
Yeah, that made sense. Thank you.
Right, no problem. Faith, did you have a question before Jasmine?
Oh yeah, it was just so I had a question, like, what is the position of the native in Afropress or Afropess, and how does settler displacement violence interact with like the idea of a rules of analogy?
That's a really good question. So for pessimism, they argue that for indigenous people, or what is understood in post-colonial studies as the subaltern, is fundamentally distinct from the slave. And you're just gonna think about this again thematically of the conversations that they have intellectually about indigenous people, right? Well, the initial grammar, initial sort of structure of the conversation was like, oh, they're primitive, they're not really human, et cetera, and so forth. Over time, that perspective sort of to shift to like maybe being like, okay, you know, we first said that they're not human, but let's change that. Maybe it's not that they're not human, but they need to be cultivated into full human beings, which produce the grotesque, apparatus of the assimilation schools, right? Of the reservation system. And that there's still like the indigenous people are some way, they're pre-human, like they just need to be caught up to the inventions and rationalities of European peoples, or, be erased from the process, right? That is fundamentally distinct from the African turned slave, in which there was no sort of pre-conversation about the humanity of those people. So a thing that sort of also helps clarify this is like when Hortense Spillers in Mama Baby's Papas maybe is talking about the experience of Adula Ekwano, whose slave narrative becomes really popular in the 17th century, and whose slave narrative is people are still read today, especially if you're in English classes about slave narratives or African American history classes, right? Before his sort of transportation to the New World, like he was a head of a household. He had multiple wives, and like he talks about this in passing, right, as a reflection of his previous life. But what's interesting about that observation is that like, because even though Odano Ekano becomes a slave, he is in some ways complicit with a patriarchal institutional structure, right? That doesn't get recognized. That is a form of general dishonorment and natal alienation when he is eventually sort of, extracted, put on the boat, and gone towards slavery. So that's the first distinction, right? That the Black is fundamentally it's not a question of its pre-humanity. The Black is foreclosed from humanity at the start. The slave is not considered human because it is a sentient being. It is an object that can be accumulated and used by the will of the master without restraint, which is also called fungibility. Fungibility just refers to your ability to freely use an object how you see fit. The other difference that pessimism says that happens from settler dispossession is that they have some sort of coherence to the land, like the ability for indigenous folks to be like, go back to Europe, white people, is a sort of feature of humanists. That you have a claim to relationality. This is my land, that we have cultivated it. We have built a particular institution, and we have built a particular structure. You have violated that as an intruder. Slaves don't have that access. Like, remember how Lee Robert Brown was like, you literally imported me from, like, my ancestors have been imported here and extracted from Africa, right? Like, that relationship becomes cut after a certain point, especially in history and time, the further you get away from that moment of departure, right? There's no sort of claims to land that are coherent in the context of the slave. Like, that's why like the whole go back to Africa movement doesn't really make sense. If like, for example, you grew up in the suburbs of Detroit, like, and if your family doesn't have intense ties to the continent, then like, where are you going to go? Like, even if you do a 23andMe geological survey, like, what does it mean for you to go back to those African countries that were then later colonized, and then in turn, still subject to the post-colonial issues that we see today? And I guess the third thing is what I talked about earlier, is that the distinction between the violence that happens towards the slave and those that have Blackness bound to slaveness, and the violence that happens to the post-colonial subject is distinct, especially indigenous folks, because while it is, and you can obviously take issue with this claim, there's a terminal conclusion to settler genocide, that the savage is gone, that we fully territorialized, cultivated the land, so forth, right? Or we have assimilated those savages, and now they have become more representative of what we consider humanity. But for the slave, as it is sort of this feature of a collective and psyche, this feature where people can put all their anxieties about what is pathological, what is desirable, right? Or what Wilderson and Fanon talk about in terms of negrophobogenesis. Whoever says AIDS says rap, whoever says AIDS says Black, whoever says rape says Black, whoever says poverty says Black, etc., right? That means that in order for society to cohere itself, in order for it to have conflicts in which to legitimize itself, there's only a certain point of death that happens towards Black folk before like they have to basically, refill the stock. There are two sort of I guess, examples that point to this. You can again take the Black Lives Matter movement, the sort of massive mobilization that's like, we need to fight for our democracy. Every 3 to 6 years that's been happening from multiple decades whenever somebody gets killed by the police, right? There's those particular images, those particular scenes of subjection or scenes of violence only work mostly to cohere the coherency of the people around them, being like, gee whiz, I'm glad that's not my life, but that's so awful, because how can we live in a society that allows for those things to happen, right? But they never get to the point of actually being able to sort of totally get rid of the system or to make broad stranding structural changes and collective changes that ultimately make that death go away, because it helps fuel the drama that allows other people in civil society to have some sense of coherency, some sense of self, and gratitude for their position in the world as agents of change. And I guess the second historical example is like the invention of the Electoral College and the ability of like population counts to dictate political authority, which is why once after that institution was sort of structured, what the sovereign slaveholding states started to do was create massive breeding farms, right? To produce more slaves so they had more political power. And like they really didn't care about those bodies. It didn't really matter what they were used for, right? Like they were just there as political currency in order to sort of cultivate the power of another one, which is again distinct from settler colonialism, in which that process doesn't happen. It happens by way of miscegenation and assimilation, which in and of itself is violent, but is distinct from the violence that happens to slaves that pessimism talks about. So hopefully that provided some clarity, Faith, because I went on 2 different directions, but that's why these things are recorded. All right. Anybody else before I call it? And also, if you have any other questions, schedule office hours, use the research channel, right? Especially if you end up reviewing this lecture or some of the additional materials. Like if you want to watch Punishment Park on your own, you can find it on Amazon under one of the sub channels. So I forget which one, but if you ask me about it, I'll try to look it up for you, and other things as well. Okay. Well, I hope you all have the good rest of y'all's day. I hope this was informative. I hope it gave you some perspective as how the conversations around pessimism can go, the ways in which you can answer pessimism, and the ways in which that might relate to other aspects of Black studies or other forms of critical theory going into the fall.
Thank you.
No problem. Thank you for coming. All right, I'm gonna close this room now, so.
Yeah, that was awesome, Kaine. Thank you so much.
Oh no, I'm so sorry. I was mostly concerned about time. I felt like I wasn't trying to go too far over.
All good. You're good on time. So
Oh,
yeah,
cool.
no, it was awesome.
All right.
All right. Peace.
Have a good one.